So now we're going to talk about sin. The language of sin has been used to do great harm. But I'm a believer. I'm going to try and evangelize for the importance of the doctrine of sin. It's so useful in understanding what's going on in the world. It's just so vital. But it's been misused so badly that we do have to be careful about how we speak. So one of the quirky things about the Reformed tradition is an understanding of sin that uses the phrase total depravity. So this could, and often to a lot of people does, sound like we're just messes. We're just awful. We're bad, and bad and more bad. I used to hear it that way, and there are certainly places where that's how it comes across. But actually, it's a little different. The idea, we just talked about how we are made in the image of God. We have an inherent, that's a thing of dignity and honor. That's amazing. We're made in the image of God. If you imagine the human person made in the image of God as a glass, a clear glass of clean water, and then imagine sin as a drop of green ink that's dropped in. Within a couple of minutes, there'll be no part of that water that isn't green. It's still H2O. We are still made in the image of God, but we are tainted by sin. We are distorted by sin. And there is no part of us that escapes it, right? It's not like if I could just trust my gut, it's sinless. Or if I'm really careful to think clearly and do what's rational, I'll somehow escape it. There is no part of us that is untainted by sin. And sin distorts our understanding and distorts our actions in the world. Put bluntly, we screw it up. Everything. Always. We don't get anything entirely right. Even if I do something really good, really objectively, that's a good thing to do, the second later I'll be feeling awfully proud of myself and how I am better than that person over there who didn't do it. And my motives are never that pure to begin with, right? I am always thinking about myself more than I should. I am always turning in on myself. So Luther talked about sin as inward turningness. Oh, my goodness, I'm so inward turning. But we all are. And that notion that it's a universal condition is really important. Sin is both a situation that we're in, that we are part of a fallen world and a broken humanity, and it's individual acts that we do. We screw it up. So many of us were vaguely taught that original sin had something to do with sex, and many of us were vaguely taught that it means we're basically bad, and especially our bodies are, temptations we need to keep in check. But so those kinds of teachings can make it hard for us to receive this wisdom. The reason I love it and think we need to really talk about sin is because it gives us good conceptual tools to talk about ways in which we are communally broken and individually act out of and into that brokenness. So there is another theologian I will reference, Schleiermacher. Let's see if I can spell that. And he talks about sin and original sin and says that it is in each the work of all and in all the work of each. That each one of us screw up, and that contributes to this state of original sin in which we find ourselves. And we are formed and shaped by that state and situation, And so we act out in actual sin where we mess things up. Now, I know that isn't the clearest thing ever, so let me give you an example. Let's talk about racism in the United States. Now, it really wasn't the case that there were 5 individuals twirling their mustaches saying, let's build an entire country on the oppression of people with darker skin. But there were people who were broken, and they created structures from the beginning of this country's founding through the devastation of Native American populations and chattel slavery and all these other things. They created a system, structures that we live within, and that those systems and structures can keep going even if there is no evil intent or meanness, right? It's beyond our control. It takes on a life of its own. So I'm going to give a little history lesson on something totally different, but just go with me. It helps understand sin. So after the Great Depression, you had the New Deal, and the New Deal was a really great thing, right? It was a way to try and help people out of extreme poverty, and it is held up as a bastion of good policy. This worked. Before the Great Depression, before the New Deal, if you wanted to own your own home, you had to put down like 50% of the total cost and pay off the rest in 5 years. So very, very few people could own their own home. It was the kind of thing that was reserved for the wealthy. And that's part of the reason that housing during the Great Depression was so precarious and so many people were left homeless. So part of the New Deal was the creation of federally subsidized housing loans. So the 30-year mortgage that we are all familiar with was invented as a way to help people out of poverty. So if you could then put down 20% of the total cost of your home and pay it off over 30 years, so home ownership was available to a lot more people. So the people who cooked this up were generally acting out of good motives, right? They were working hard to figure out, how do we help the American people? How do we help people who are homeless? How do we assist those who are in trouble? But these people had also been born and raised in the country where slavery happened. And they had blind spots, and their water was green. Their vision was tainted. And so what happened was, before you could get one of these new federally subsidized 30-year mortgages, one of these home loans, the government sent evaluators into every community across the United States, and they would sort out which areas of town were a safe bet for the government to invest in. Lo and behold, a line was put in each community, and that line, that red line that determined where you could get a federally subsidized 30-year mortgage, outlined communities of people of color and Jewish folks, and you couldn't get a loan there. So black communities were redlined, right? They couldn't get one of these loans. So the Federal Housing Administration gave $1 gazillion in housing loans. It was the largest wealth-generating policy ever created in the United States history. Did amazing things for the white middle class, but black folks couldn't get it. Now, what happens? First of all, the people doing this were trying to do the right thing. But imagine that in 1934, you have one couple that's white and one couple that's black. These folks get a home loan, backed by the federal government. Fabulous. Then they have kids. Their kids get married. They got people, more people. These folks have people too. Kids who get married. In the United States, the vast majority of first-time homeowners are able to get that to make that down payment on their home by using the equity in their parents' homes. Their parents got a loan, their parents have been paying this down for years, they've got some home equity, they give $10,000 to their kids. Their kids can use that as a down payment on their house. You with me? I know this seems far afield from theology, but trust me. So what has happened over the years is that these white parents and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren have homes that they own, and they have the wealth of that equity. Black family, same circumstances, was redlined out of getting a federally subsidized mortgage, couldn't pass on any equity to help their children get mortgages. And so all this family and those children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are living in apartments. It doesn't seem like such a big deal, right? It's unfortunate, but then when you start looking closer, homeownership has all these other things attached to it. If you've got home equity and your car breaks down, you've got backup. If somebody's got, it's a way of generating wealth so that you can actually have a little bit of a safety net. At the same time, these folks owning homes are more likely to live in suburban settings, right? Whereas the folks in the apartments are more likely to live in more densely populated urban areas. There are other things that go with this. Apartments and urban areas, you're much more likely to have a lead poisoning for your kids, which causes behavioral problems and decreases IQ points. If you live in the suburbs, you own your own home, you're less likely to have that. If blacks and whites in the United States use illegal drugs in equal numbers. That's the statistic that I have, but it's from a couple of years ago, and so I'm not entirely sure that it wouldn't be shifted now due to the opioid epidemic in rural areas like Kentucky and West Virginia. So it might be now that whites use illegal drugs in greater proportion, but at the very least, equal proportion. But black folks are much more likely to get arrested, and they're much more likely to go to jail for the same crime. Now, part of the reason is that you're less likely to be found with marijuana in your suburban home than you are if you live in an apartment. If you own your own home, you're probably buying and selling whatever you're doing in your own home. These folks might be in an apartment building or a common shared space within, the common yard of the apartment building, which is public property, and where you might, not public property, but it was communal property. The police officers who are tasked to go out and find drug users are going to be driving through this neighborhood, not this one. Furthermore, this neighborhood, because it's more densely populated, is more likely to be in a school zone, in a drug-free zone, which means that the penalties for the exact same possession of marijuana, whatever it is, for the exact same crime will be much higher here just because of where it's located. So I hope you're getting some kind of a picture that well-intended decisions made by people years ago can take up, they don't dissipate over time, they snowball. They create structures that break our relationships with one another and with God and with the earth, that make it harder for some folks than for others to build any kind of financial security, to escape the school-to-prison pipeline, to be treated fairly. Okay, so you can imagine the sins, the actual sins of the folks who created the housing program as part of the New Deal. We're going to grant them the best of intentions. We are going to not imagine that they were vicious racists. They were doing their best, but they grew up in a world where white people mattered a lot more than black people, and so they screwed up. That screw up takes on a life of its own and affects the whole country. And then we start to have these stereotypes of urban African Americans who do lots of drugs and are crime-ridden. And in reality, that's not what's going on. But those stereotypes then lead to racist, biased, prejudiced attitudes. So what I'm trying to get at is the way actual sin, redlining, contributes to original sin, ongoing prejudice against people of color, ongoing structures that are in place that we don't even notice, that distort our best attempts at being kind to one another. And then that original sin, we grow up with those images, with those that segregation that keeps us from knowing from one another. Part of why I find this so helpful is because it moves us away from an individualistic understanding of guilt and innocence. When it comes to a really big issue like racism in the United States, it's not that I as a white person, I am not guilty. I didn't make this structure. I didn't cause slavery. But I'm also not innocent. I'm part of it, and I benefit from it. And so the terms innocence and guilt just don't really help. They are not nuanced enough or sophisticated enough to describe how we can be part of a brokenness that is communal, that then takes root in us, and we act in such ways that we contribute to the communal brokenness. The Christian doctrine of sin can do that. The Christian doctrine of sin can talk about our failings, our taintedness, our distortions in ways that are both individual and collective. And not just describe it, but also help us think about how we can move forward. Because God doesn't just leave us in this state of sin. God actually offers us ways out. Because we are up to our eyeballs, and no part of us is untainted, if I were to try and imagine my way out of sin, my imagination's got the green ink in it too. We need help getting out of this mess, and God offers that help to us. Now, as a Reformed theologian, you know where I'm going here. God's grace that helps us deal with the problem of sin comes in Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus, we know, was a poor Jewish man who lived in the Middle East, who had brown skin and black hair. He was conceived out of wedlock and born during forced travel. He grew up in occupied territory. The Palestinian, what would now be Palestine, the area he was living in, was occupied by the Roman Empire. And he behaved in very particular ways in response to the situation around him. And we know about those ways. We've learned about them in the stories and the parables, the miracles, and the moments of challenge and the moments of ridiculous kindness and generosity that he offered to the people around him. He died on a cross, and he rose from the dead. Very, very quickly after his death and resurrection, Christians started praying not just to God about Jesus, but to Jesus. The first order theology of those early believers, they spoke of him as divine. The fancy name for this doctrine is Christology. Talk about Christ. Within that, we have the doctrine of the Incarnation, which means enfleshment, that the divine became flesh. The notion that God became flesh has implications for us here and now. Going back to what we're talking about with dualism, it means that God thinks this dust and ashes is the space where holiness resides, that our bodies matter immeasurably. Jesus lived in a particular way, and we see, as we talked about in terms of eschatology, we see the future God intends for us in the way Jesus lived with his fellows, with the women and men and outcasts and powerful around him. We see that that kind of engagement with other people goes against the sinful structures of empire. He didn't act the way he was expected to. And stuff like that gets a person killed. It got him killed, it's gotten others killed. You know, my kids ask me, why did Jesus die? And I try not to answer in the stuffy academic way. He was a messianic pretender. He challenged the power structure of the day. And what I found myself saying is, he said that God loved everybody. And those in power really wanted to believe that God loved them best. It's a simple answer, but I still think it's true. So he died. And he died an embarrassing, shameful death. And it's not the last word. He was raised again from the dead. And yes, I have 5 advanced degrees, and I truly believe he was raised from the dead on the 3rd day, and the tomb was empty, and the women who went found no one there. So there are lots of different parts of this story. I'm going to draw you a little diagram. My artwork is not the best. This is going to be a manger, little baby Jesus. That's the Incarnation. This is a chalice. We're going with that as a symbol for the life and ministry of Jesus. Here's the cross. That one we know. I don't know how else to do this. We have an empty tomb. This is the event of Jesus. And it goes backward all the way through the relationship, covenantal relationship between the Hebrew people and God that Jesus was a part of. He was a faithful Jew his entire life. And all the way forward to that future that's coming towards us that God intends. Now, all these parts are important. They're all in Scripture. They are all meaningful. It doesn't work to say, the cross doesn't matter that much if it isn't the fact that it was God on the cross. And the cross isn't very understandable except for the fact that it's the guy who said God loves everyone the same that is the one who's killed. And what in the world would the resurrection mean if it was not connected to the cross? These things are all connected. At the same time, it's important, in order to have a coherent theology, to think a bit about which bit does the saving part. Which bit changes our relationship to God and one another and the earth? Which bit addresses our fallenness, our brokenness, our sinfulness? You can do a coherent theology with any of these. It could be the case, and you get this with our buddy Friedrich Schleiermacher, that when God becomes human, the relationship between humanity and the divine is changed forever. We broke off our right relationship with God, and God's like, no, buddy, I'm coming in. We are going to be joined. God takes us into God's own self, and God comes to be Emmanuel, God with us, and that brokenness is healed. It could be the life and ministry. There are a fair number of Christians who talk about Jesus as a moral exemplar, that God in Jesus Christ shows us what a godly life looks like. God lives out and demonstrates for us that future that God intends for us, and that gives us a way to move forward to that future. A whole lot of people in our day and age talk about the cross as that moment where something happens that changes the relationship between God and humanity forever. And then for some folks, it's the resurrection, that life is a battle between good and evil, and good won. Life triumphed over death, and that means that the death of sin is not the final word. Lo, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. So I grew up having a sense that Jesus saves, but I kind of assumed that everybody knew what that meant, and we all thought the same thing. But the truth is that internal diversity in Christianity and that mystery of God means that over the years, across time and space, Christian communities have come up with lots of different ways of trying to understand what happened. How did this Jesus guy save us? The relationship between us and God has been permanently altered. How? And that internal diversity is really both wide, can be any of these things, and deep. So just within the notion that the saving event happened on the cross, there are lots of different things. There's the ransom theory of atonement, an oldie but a goodie. It was popular for 1,000 years, that the devil had captured us and Jesus paid the ransom to get us back. It's really more sophisticated than that. There's a notion that this was a kind of sacrifice, a ritual sacrifice that God made on our behalf. There's a notion of, and this was a favorite of Calvin's, substitution. This one's quite popular in Reformed theology, that humanity was guilty, Jesus was innocent, Jesus stands in our stead. So for Calvin, Jesus takes upon himself the punishment that we deserve. That's not all Calvin said, but it's part of it. And we get the freedom that Jesus deserved. There's a really fabulous theory by Anselm, a medieval theologian, called satisfaction. And then there's a theory by a guy named Abelard, who wrote during the time of medieval lords and ladies, where you would woo your beloved with, a man would woo his beloved with great acts of valor and courage on the battlefield. And so you imagine like a knight going jousting and, a lady throwing her handkerchief to him. It's very romantic. And for Abelard, the cross is a grand romantic gesture where God does the most dangerous thing God can do to woo us and win our affection. There are lots of different ways of thinking about this that are good theology. Now, I'm going to stir that pot just a little bit by introducing you to another Reformed theologian, Dolores Williams. So Williams is an African-American woman, and she's troubled by accounts of salvation in which what happens is that Jesus stands surrogate for humanity, that Jesus takes our role and stands surrogate for us in the cross. So things like penal substitution or the substitutionary atonement, she's worried about that. And she's worried about it because there is a very, very long history in the United States of black women being forced to stand surrogate for others, to give birth to children under slavery, legally forced to do so, to take on social roles that were at the time reserved for men, such as being a field hand, both under slavery and soon after, to socially coerced to be surrogate parents, as black women provided childcare or were wet nurses for white women well past slavery up until today, because of the limited options. And she says, look, black women have suffered a lot by being surrogates for others. They take on the heavy work, they take on the suffering, and I don't think that's right. But how do we say no to it if surrogacy, surrogate suffering, is the logic God uses on the cross? If this is divine algebra, how do we reject it? So here, and I know I'm getting deep in the weeds, I'm going to introduce you to an anthropologist named Clifford Geertz. He studied religion. He said all kinds of brilliant, fabulous things, and probably said some stupid things too, I don't know. But he said this one thing that I find really, really fascinating. He said that models of God are models for society. And this works both ways. If we think that God is a king, we're likely to organize our societies such that it's ruled by a king. At the same time, if we have a society ruled by a king, we're probably going to think that God's like a king. That it works both ways. If we think that God is a warrior, we are more likely to have a society of war. If we have a society of war, we're likely to envision God as a warrior, right? So you can't separate out how we understand God and how we choose to live in our communities. They really influence one another deeply. And so William says, if we imagine that in order to save us from sin, God had to kill God's own Son on a bloody cross, how are we ever going to say it's not okay to make one person suffer on behalf of another? If we say that Jesus saves us by suffering on our behalf, how are we going to say it's not okay to make other people suffer on our behalf? Now, she says that the logic of surrogate suffering on the cross makes suffering sacred and makes enforcing the suffering of others sacred. Now, that's troubling for those of us who grew up with images of being saved by the blood of the cross. For those of us who cherish some of these theologies that really emphasize the cross, Williams kind of comes like a punch in the gut. Wait a minute. And my first response is defensive. No, that's not what we mean. We mean we're going to suffer for others. But then she can point to history and, dude, that's not really what Christians do. We're really good at making other people suffer for us. We're not so good at suffering for others. But still, I'm defensive. There's got to be another way. Here's the thing. William's argument is so good that you can't jump around it. Its sources, very biblical. Its coherence, it's a tight argument. And it's really concerned with the ethical implications of our theology. So however we're going to talk about how Jesus saves us from sin, we need to reckon with this theologian who's really, really put a good thing out there. Now for Williams, she goes to life and ministry. She says that Jesus saves us through his ministerial vision, through how we see him behave and interact with others. That's possible. You can do that. I'm not saying that you can't say coherently and well that Jesus' death on a cross is what saves us. I am saying this is complicated, and there's a lot of room for argument. These are old arguments we've got going in these doctrines. Now, some people suggest that there should be one more place on the timeline, that there should be, in the Jesus event, also church. And this has been suggested by Anabaptist theologians and Episcopal theologians, that the ongoing life of Jesus in the church is part of this Jesus event and might well be part of the saving that Jesus does for us. Reformed theology is really tricky with that. Because we are so self-critical, because we are so aware that religious structures can really screw it up. Actually, we're sure will really screw it up. It is not quite coherent for a Reformed theology to take the church itself as having an active salvific role. We can point people to Jesus, we can point people to God, we can witness to the Holy Spirit, but saving is an artwork to do, even in a little bit.